Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. My name is Benji, and today we're going to be talking about 5 tips regarding Toadally Awesome. This is a totally awesome monster. It's been around for years, being played in a lot of decks now because they're on frog engines. Just wanted to suggest that you try Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion against this card, and that's because Ghost Belle can actually negate the activation of Toad's effect if it were to be negating a monster card. The reason for that is if Toad negates a monster and destroys it, it can set the card, and this counts as a special summon, which meets the criteria of Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion. Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion says that when a card effect is activated, that would special summon a monster from the graveyard, you can negate the activation, and Toadally Awesome meets this requirement. Now, something I don't necessarily agree with, but this is the way it is ruled, is that you can actually do this also if the monster being negated by Toadally Awesome is a link monster. And the reason I don't necessarily agree with this, it is the way it works, is because the link monster could never be set. And there are some precedent rules on cards like Crusadia Vanguard and that kind of say that if the card could not possibly do the thing that Ash meets, that it can't be ashed. In this case, a link monster can't possibly be set by Toad, but the difference in those cards is one of them is you choose it on activation, whereas Toad you don't choose until it resolves. So for that reason, even if a link monster were to have its effect negated by Toad and get destroyed, you could still bell that effect, even though it can't possibly special summon the card. Just something else to know. You can also bell the attempt to negate the activation of a pendulum spell card being placed in the pendulum zone because it is a monster, and if a pendulum monster in the pendulum zone will be destroyed by Toadally Awesome, you can set it as a monster, even though pendulum spells can't be set. So for that reason, the activation of Toadally Awesome to negate the activation of any monster, including link monsters, or pendulum monsters, even as pendulum spells, can be belled. A couple of things I want to mention about cards that Toadally Awesome can't special summon, which doesn't mean you can't bell these scenarios, because Toad is still trying to negate a monster, which means it could potentially set on resolution, even though that the cards can't be set, is if a monster that is not properly summoned, such as a monster that's special summoned by the effect of Ultimaya Zulkin, Toad cannot attempt to set those monsters. So if a Crystal Wing was summoned by Ultimaya Zulkin and its effect was negated and it was destroyed, Toad could not special summon it because it was not properly summoned originally. Also, if there's a monster who is already in the graveyard and Toad negates it, it can't destroy the card that's already in the graveyard, and because it can't destroy the card, it can't set the card. So Toad cannot set cards that it cannot destroy. It cannot destroy cards that are, cards that say they can't be destroyed. So if the card on the field gets protected by a card, you won't be able to set it because you won't destroy the card. If the card's already in the graveyard, it can't be destroyed, and if the card's already in the banish zone, it can't be destroyed. So these are just things you need to know about Toadally Awesome and cool interactions with Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion. So our second tip is going to be regarding the cards that are destroyed by Toadally Awesome. So if you were to destroy Tier Elements merely, I got to get used to these TCG names, but if this card is set to the graveyard by a card effect, it can activate its effect to Fusion Summon. Now, if Toadally Awesome were to negate the activation and destroy the card, it goes to the graveyard, but Toad also then sets it in the same chain, and this is the Ben 10 ruling. If you're not familiar with the Ben 10 ruling, excuse me, my air conditioner turned on, forgot that was on. But the Ben 10 ruling says that a card needs to be in the place where it meets its activation condition in order to activate its effect. So the effect of the Tier Elements monsters in the graveyard activate in the graveyard. So if Toad sets them, it'll never be in the graveyard to activate its effect. Now, Tier Elements aren't the best example for this, specifically because they fuse with themselves, and they obviously can't fuse with themselves if they're not on your field. A different type of scenario that's similar to this, but not the same, is like Tier Elements Kaleido Heart. It says that if an Aqua monster is sent to your graveyard while this card is on the field, you can target one card your opponent controls and shuffle into the deck. So if your opponent were to negate your Merly while you control Kaleido Heart, you send the Merly to the graveyard from the field. If it were to activate its on-field effect, you would destroy it and then you would set it. But the card did go to the graveyard, and Kaleido Heart was on the field to witness that occur. Even though it's not in the graveyard anymore, by the time the chain resolved, the card had gone to the graveyard and then come back from the graveyard, so you would be able to activate the effect of Tier Elements Kaleido Heart. All right, now our next tip is on legal times you're legally allowed to activate Toadally Awesome. Under Goes and Match, you are allowed to activate Toad because it sets the monster, so you actually wouldn't be restricted from setting the card, even though you can only control monsters of a certain attribute. Under Dimension Shifter, you can't activate the effect of Toadally Awesome because its requirement to negate a monster or a spell or a trap card is that you have to, let's see, you have to send one Aqua monster from your hand or face up on your field to the graveyard. So you can't send cards to the graveyard under Dimension Shifter. There are some other types of cards you can kind of apply this sort of. If your opponent has Virtual World, QB Shen Shen, Cards that would be sent to the graveyard from the field are banished, but cards from your hand are not. So you could negate with Toad using a Aqua from your hand while Shen Shen is on the board. So it's important to know that there are some scenarios where you may not be able to activate Toad because you can't send the cards to the appropriate location, and there are some other scenarios where you can sometimes do that. You can also activate Toad and actually resolve its effect under Skill Drain and Dimensional Barrier. So if you have summoned a Toad and your opponent flips a Skill Drain or applies Dimensional Barrier, because both of these cards only negate the monsters on the field, if they send themselves to the graveyard as cost, their effects resolve. So I've done this with lots of different cards in the past. You can droplet your cards off the board to make them resolve under both of these effects, but that's something that you should know, is that if you are legally allowed to activate them, even though your cards are negated. If they're not on the field, under Skill Drain and Dimensional Barrier, they'll resolve. If they were just Impermed or Dark Ruler, they would not resolve. The graveyard effects are not affected whatsoever, so Toad would be able to add a card from the graveyard to the hand, even if we're negated by Skill Drain, D-Barrier, Velor, or anything else. And our next tip is regarding... Whoa, jumping around here. I got to get used to using this. Our next tip is on graveyard effects. Totally Awesome cannot negate the effects of cards that activate in the graveyard. Galaxy Cyclone says, other than the turn that this card was sent to the graveyard, you can banish this card from the graveyard to target one face-up spell or trap card on the field and destroy it. So Totally Awesome cannot negate that effect, and it's because of this part of its text. It says, when your opponent activates a spell or trap card or monster effect, to activate a spell or trap card means to place it face-up on the field, not to trigger its effect of a card that's already face-up on the field, which is what Ogre can be used on. It's also does not count effects that activate in the graveyard. So Totally Awesome cannot negate a face-up spell or trap card that triggers its separate effect other than when it's flipped face-up. It cannot negate graveyard effects of spells or trap cards, such as Galaxy Cyclone, but it does on monsters, and that's because monsters always activate wherever they are, whereas spells and traps have to be placed face-up to be considered activating. And our last tip is regarding the things you can do with the cards that you steal from your opponent. Obviously, if you take a trap card and it gets set by Totally Awesome, you can't activate it the turn you set it. You couldn't do that with a quick play spell either, because those are just the rules of trap cards and spell cards. And that's going to wrap this up. If you want to know more about spells and traps and things like that, leave a comment. I have some videos and the cards up above. I covered the entire rulebook not that long ago. A lot of people don't know the rules, have never read the rulebook. Would highly recommend it. I go through all the pages of the rulebook. There's more 5-tip videos to look at, and I'll see you guys next time. How to Spright is coming soon.